Welcome to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, hosting insightful conversations with fascinating people to shape the way that Britain interacts with the world. In this episode, we talk about the EU, firstly with Aline Burni, a policy advisor based in Brussels, and then with Mike Buckley, the director of the Independent Commission on UK-EU Relations. So welcome, Aline. I'm so happy to have you here, and let's dive into the EU. Tell us about your experience and background and why I'm coming to you on this.
Sure. Thank you so much, Anna Joy, for the invitation. I'm very happy to participate in the podcast. So I'm Aline. I'm a political scientist. I have a PhD from the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. I'm originally from Brazil, but I've always been very interested on the EU and European politics. So I started learning French early on in my university studies, and I also went to France for part of my studies. And when I was in France, it was this year when Marine Le Pen was elected leader of the Front National at the time, now the National Rally. And I thought that was a very curious phenomenon to see a woman taking the lead of a far-right party. And she was also aiming at modernizing the party. She was very easygoing with the media. So I decided to study this phenomenon of the rise of far-right, populist, radical right parties in Europe. So this is what I've been doing since then for my master's, for my PhD. I've been researching, analyzing, and providing insights on EU politics and policies for about 10 years now. And for the last 5 to 6 years, I've been working in this think tank and policy field in Europe. I worked in Bonn in Germany, and now for the last 3 years, I've been in Brussels and working as an advisor.
I didn't know that about how you first got interested in the EU, and that's of course very relevant to what we're going to be talking about. So that's amazing. So yeah, you're based in Brussels. You follow EU politics and policy closely, and so you're the perfect person to have a quick conversation with about what's just happened in the EU Parliament results. And I'm really keen for you to tell us, summarise what's happened, but also tell us how analysts are understanding it.
Well, so Europeans went to the polls to elect the 720 parliamentarians for the European Parliament. The elections happened from the 6th to the 9th June. And the results of the elections were quite aligned with predictions. So there was an expectation around a more right-wing leaning parliament. This is effectively what we had. We also saw some important losses for the more progressive forces, so especially the Greens and the Liberals under the Renew Europe group that is spearheaded by Macron. They have lost about 20 seats each, so this is quite significant. But there was also a big expectation, a big hype around the rise of far-right parties. They indeed have gained a bit of more power, more seats, but it hasn't been a phenomenal rise as some expected. So this has been basically the results. Now, I think what called most attention in the election night was the decision of President Macron to dissolve the National Assembly in France and to call for early elections there. So there will be elections to elect a new parliament in France. First round on the 30th of June and second round on the 7th of July. And this has, of course, brought new uncertainties to the European scenario because France is a big player in European politics along with Germany. And although we haven't seen the expected or anticipated or feared by some rise of the far right in the European Parliament, we saw it happening in France and Germany. So these are the two countries that saw a very strong far right in the latest European elections.
Yeah, France and Germany and Macron's response. Just give us a quick outline of a few of the other countries, what happened or didn't happen in those.
Sure. So both the rise of the far right and the loss of the progressives, the Greens and the Liberals, were mainly driven by what happened in Germany and France. And these are the biggest member states, so they also have the biggest portion, the biggest number of seats in the parliament. But we saw there are nuances in other countries. So the S&D, the Social Democrats, still remain stable overall, still stronger in Southern Europe and the Nordics. On the Central European states, you have a bit of a battle between right-wing forces and more radical right forces. But overall, you have these nuances with Greens and Social Democrats still resisting, especially in the Nordics and the southern part of Europe.
Poland's important at the moment, isn't it? How does Poland fit in with France and Germany in terms of balancing things out?
Yeah, so this eastern front of Europe is, of course, very much on the spotlight because of the war of Russia against Ukraine. So they are very important in everything happening in the EU, especially because of the enlargement plans for Ukraine in the European Union, the accession of new countries to the EU. And of course, Poland and the eastern countries are in the front line of this war. What we've seen there is that people are indeed very worried about defense and security. They are very much supportive of more active European Union in terms of security and defense. And we saw also that Tusk has been successful in Poland as well. And in general, far right forces are still alive, and they tend to be more pro Putin or less transatlantic and less favorable to European security and NATO.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's come on even more in a minute to the general state of play. But just staying with the EU elections for a bit, there was commentary on the Greens, wasn't there? And whether green issues and the green agenda, whether there was a lack of support of those because Green parties lost votes. But I saw some commentary about the fact that that's not necessarily the reading.
We have seen already for quite some time that even the EPP, the European People's Party, which is the party of the President of the Commission, von der Leyen, even the EPP has been quite critical around the European Green Deal for some time already. So the general sense is that the Green Deal has caused some fatigue, and that there has been lots of legislation, regulation coming up, but it was time for the EU now to implement those regulations. So this has been a general criticism that was rising even a bit before the elections, I would say. So I think in a way the results, given that we saw a stronger right wing in the parliament, it has been wrongly interpreted, I think, by some analysts that this is a sign that people are no longer supporting the European Green Deal. But I think this is not the case. We have seen some research showing that actually people continue to be worried about climate change as an issue. This is still a big concern of people, and they still support the European Green Deal. So the question now is really about how this is going to be implemented. It's about being transparent about the costs, how this will work in practice. But it doesn't mean that people abandon the idea that action needs to be taken around climate change. So what we expect to see is not a full abandonment of the Green Deal, because also we saw that the Democratic Center holds a majority in Europe, still holds a majority, and they are supportive of the Green Deal. But what we might see is more focus on the competitiveness, economic dimensions of the Green Deal, and a bit less ambitious in terms of setting new targets or or new legislation, especially if it's legislation that affects the farmer communities a lot. So we might see a shift in the framing, in the approach, but we wouldn't expect the European Green Deal to be completely abandoned.
Yeah. And you said the S&D grouping, it didn't change that much. And that was actually, would you say that was better than expected? That actually the perspective for the progressives in Europe it's not necessarily a negative picture, or at least
Yes,
not as bad as feared.
I actually agree. So I think the fact that they managed to keep around the same level, around the same number of seats, is a sign that they are resisting, and especially given some recent scandals involving S&D members, the Qatar Gate, for example, that happened in Europe. So I think they managed, and also given the national trends that saw some social democrats losing ground in some countries, for example, in Portugal and in Spain as well, although they are still in power and they still managed to build a new coalition. I think overall they were losing some ground in some national states. So I think it is a sign of resistance that they maintain around the same level as before. Although, of course, this new parliament is also bigger. So before we used to have 705 members, and this parliament has 720. So this makes them proportionately a bit smaller. But I think overall is in line with what polls were saying, and they managed to meet the expectations.
Yeah, and it's always interesting, I guess, doing the analysis of the parliament elections, because some countries, the populations will use it as a referendum on the current government as well, won't they? And so it's trying to translate through what that means as well. Tell us just quickly what this means for positions in the EU and what they mean.
The European Parliament elections actually only start a whole process that will result in a new EU institutional cycle. So the outcome of the elections give an overall picture of the balance of power, the balance of political power in the EU, but they are only one part of everything that's coming up. So we are actually now waiting for the nominations, the candidates for the 4 top EU jobs. So these are the President of the Commission, the President of the Council, the President of the European Parliament, and the High Representative of the European Union. So this is the Foreign Affairs representative of the European Union. And these are the 3 most important institutions of the EU: the Council, which is composed of the head of states and governments of the member state, 27 member states. The Commission is a more supranational, the bureaucratic body of the EU, and this is where the bills, the projects for legislation come from. The Commission is composed of a college of commissioners. These are the sort of ministers of the EU government, and each commissioner is appointed by one member state. So this is also another battleground, because the EU Commission is a more supranational body, but it is also impacted by national political dynamics, because usually the governments of the governments of the member states appoint a commissioner. That also has, the whole commission will have to go to be approved to the Parliament, and the commissioners will go through hearings in the European Parliament as well. So it's there's quite a lot to happen, and this is why we only expect to see a fully formed new commission taking office by November or even December this year. And the Parliament is also an important institution, but it has some limited powers on some crucial decisions, because actually it works differently from the national parliaments. It doesn't propose legislation, but it makes amendments and approves or not proposals coming from the Commission. So the Parliament is, of course, important also in terms of oversighting budget, checking what the Commission is doing and how it is implementing the legislation. But the political decisions really come from the Council, and the legislative decisions or the proposals come from the Commission. So for the 4 top EU jobs, we were expecting some agreement among the EU leaders earlier this week, but it didn't happen. So we still have to wait for the next EU Council summit, which will be end of this month in June. But I think the picture is that von der Leyen is likely to be appointed for a second term. So she first needs to be appointed by the Council, which is the institution composed of the heads of states and governments of the EU member states. It is expected that she will be reappointed, but then she needs to build a majority in the European Parliament, because she has to be approved. She has to get the absolute majority of votes in the European Parliament. And this is likely to happen, but still there's lots of uncertainties around there, because she has to find a compromise not only with the centrist groups, right, the Renew and S&D, but also she might need to get support from other parties pulling in different directions in this political spectrum. The other names that we've heard a lot about are Antonio Costa, who is likely to be appointed for the post of President of the Council. He was the Prime Minister of Portugal, and he's part of the S&D family. And we were speaking before about the remaining significant weight of the S&D family. And this is indeed one of the signs that they are still waiting a lot in European affairs. They are very likely to get one of these top jobs. And the other names that we hear a lot about is probably Kaja Kallas. She's Prime Minister of Estonia. She could be appointed for the High Representative job. Or also a possibility is De Croo. He is the outgoing Prime Minister of Belgium, and both are from the Renew Europe family, so the family of Macron. But this is still to see, because it's true that we also have other actors that wait a lot and want to have a significant role in the next institutional cycle. So notably Giorgia Meloni from Italy. She is the leader of the ECR group, European Conservatives and Reformists, and she obviously got a very significant result at home. She won the elections in Italy, and she is expecting and putting a lot of pressure to also get a significant job in the next EU cycle. And finally, for the President of the European Parliament, we are expecting Roberta Metsola from Malta to be re-elected. And in this case, I think her appointment is clearer, because she really won as a member of the EPP, and she also got an amazing result at home. She is likely to be reappointed and to get support of the members of the European Parliament.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. That's such a great overview. And I'm interested to then step back. If you could give us a little snapshot right now about the issues and state of play and kind of where things are up to at the moment.
I think in terms of policy trends or policy directions that we can expect for the next years, we might see a more inward-looking European Union, more focused on bread and butter issues and going into more fundamental issues of the European Union, such as the single market. Enlargement will be highly on the agenda as well. We expect a commission that will not maybe not propose or new legislation, not many new legislation, but will focus more on implementation of existing frameworks. And I think we can also expect a stronger commission in terms of focus on economic security of the European Union and maybe less ambitious on green energy and environmental issues.
Yeah. And interested for you to unpack a little bit more the impact of the France and Germany dynamic. That's where you started. It was obviously a big shock to people when the French elections were called, even to the mayor of Paris, I read, just ahead of the Olympics. But one of the reasons why that is so important is because France and Germany's central role within the EU, isn't it?
Indeed, France and Germany are usually called the drivers of the European project, right? So it used to be the case before, traditionally, from a historical perspective, that if France and Germany agreed on something, that would very likely happen in the framework of the EU. Today, this is no longer the case. We mostly say that you need their agreement to have things done, but only their push is no longer enough. So they have lost a bit of power in driving things just on their own, but they are still very relevant because of their size, because of their power in the EU. So it is indeed worrying from an European Union perspective to see that the French and the German governments are coming out from these elections very weakened, much weaker, because this also means that their leaders will be focused on what's happening domestically and will spend a lot of time and work a lot to build consensus internally rather than working between themselves or working together at the EU level. So I think this has been one of the outcomes of the elections. So I would say a weakened Macron, a weakened Scholz because of their results internally. And especially, we are in a bit of an unknown territory regarding France, because I think at this point, it is unlikely that we see a far-right majority emerging from the French elections. But I think it's also not very likely to see Macron winning a new majority. So I think with the elements that we have now, and given that there is very little time for campaigning, and given that the far right is coming out from the European elections very strong, very mobilized, and very confident, I think, and we also saw that the left made a move very quickly by creating this new popular front. I think what might happen is that a new parliament in France might not see a clear majority emerging from the elections. So this will make things very complicated in terms of forming a new government and defining the position of France vis-à-vis the EU in the next years. So it can happen that we don't have this majority, even if we don't see a very strong far right, we might also not see a very strong Macron. it could be the contrary, and if he emerges strong from these elections, this will also give him more power at the EU stage. But as things stand now, I think this is not what people are expecting or anticipating. So it's really a lot of uncertainty, and this, of course, pauses things a bit at the EU level because we are all waiting to see what's going to happen in France, what is the level of support that Macron can still have and mobilize, and how this will translate in the level of the European Union. So we are all kind of expecting, still in an uncertain scenario, and a bit everything can happen. So we are waiting for that. And just final point on that. So the elections in France will be on the 30th, and on the 27th and 28th June, we are expecting this formal meeting of the council. So it's very close, and I think what we expect in France at that point, how the polls will look like, are likely to inform what happens in the council meeting as well.
Yeah, this is such a great insight into how the Brussels policy world is all on tenterhooks, wondering how this is all going to pan out, isn't it? Just very briefly, I know you're not an expert on this and we won't go into it for long, but obviously the UK has got its election coming up. What are your observations about how the UK is currently relating into the EU and what you think the EU would be hoping for after the UK election? And I know that in many situations it's not a big deal, it's not being talked about because it's not in the EU, but just, when it is looked at, what's your take?
Well, my take, and knowing that I'm not an expert on this topic, but is really, these are my impressions from a Brussels perspective and from my experience and hearing the debate here. So I think that the EU perceives a very much improved relationship with the UK since Sunak's government and with the Windsor Framework that was signed not so long ago. I think at the moment there are no big expectations of big changes if a likely Labour government wins in the UK. I would see the Social Democrats as being, of course, particularly happy and motivated, enthusiastic with a possible Labour government. So there might be a strengthened or a revitalized European interaction at the level of the Social Democrats. However, as we will have a more right-wing leaning European Union, in the event of a Labour administration in the UK, I think overall we wouldn't expect many changes, but also not only because of the different political ideologies, but also because the EU will be so focused with so many other fronts that are very challenging to it at the moment. So to name a few, Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, Europe is very much focused on de-risking from China. It will be looking to what happens in the US, that's also going to go through elections. So I think it's more a question of, it's not a big priority at the moment, but there will be interest, curiosity, enthusiasm with in the case of a new Labour government. I would not expect much big changes, but I see there has been improvement in the relation over the last months and year. And I think this is likely to be the trend for the next 5 years in Europe as well.
Thank you. And you've pulled out a few of the issues. Talked about Ukraine there. You've talked about Gaza and the regional issues. I would say the economy, migration. Just as you sit in Brussels, what are the things that you're particularly looking closely at and following that you are using to assess how things move forward?
Well, I think in the short term, we're really looking to what's going to happen in France, because as we've discussed, this has a big weight on the ways forward in European politics, because usually France also has a key or an important commissioner. So far they have Thierry Breton leading economic industrial issues. So it's a very strategic portfolio in Europe. We're looking pretty much to this. I think other issues will be how the EU will manage these three priorities. So the EU budget, fiscal part, the economy, but also how it coordinates with the European Green Deal. That means a big transformation in the economy, in the society, in the energy sectors of Europe, and also how to equate all this with European competitiveness, and in a way that Europe can still be competitive, be strong, be economically secure in a very tense and conflictual world.
In relation to the US, China, and ongoing global developments. That's such a great explanation. That's really helpful. Thank you. And I hope that will give our podcast listeners a few indications and tips around how to follow both what happens in the EU just in the upcoming weeks and months, but also looking forward at this next term. And so, to complete the picture of our conversation about the EU, I now talk to Mike Buckley, the Director at the Independent Commission on UK-EU Relations, to get the UK perspective. Brilliant. So welcome, Mike. I'm so happy to have you here because we've just talked to Aline, who is a policy advisor based in Brussels, and we had a really interesting conversation about the EU Parliament, about what's going on in the EU at the moment. And I wanted to have the UK perspective, which of course you are perfectly placed to give. So we're going to do some quick fire questions on this to round off our EU podcast. Could you first introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yes, my name is Mike Buckley. I've worked on the UK-EU relationship for about 6 years. I currently run a small think tank. It's called the Independent Commission on UK-EU Relations, and we look at two areas essentially. One, we document and try and understand the impact of the UK's departure from the EU, broadly conceived, on areas of the economy, but also looking at things like health and social care, security and defence, etc. And then more importantly, really, we look ahead and make recommendations as to what the future could look like in terms of the UK-EU relationship. But obviously that takes place within a context, the wider context being trade, the UK's place in the world, geopolitics, security and defence, Russia, Ukraine, etc. So our work is situated in a larger world, and we work very closely with business and industry, with academics and other experts.
Yeah, amazing. And just to add the personal story side, tell me what made you get into this area of work, and also your history of interaction from before Brexit, and the last, wow, is it now
8 years?
8 years.
It's been a very long time. Well, I got into it quite late, really. So, I mean, I think I always grew up an internationalist. I think my parents were very much internationalists. My mum was a French teacher. My dad travelled a lot across Europe, and he spent quite a lot of time in Germany, particularly, but other countries as well. His mum, in fact, had been a German teacher. So I think we kind of had that international mindset as a family. My first career was as an aid worker, working in places like the Middle East, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, parts of Africa. Working across the world, so very much had a kind of global mindset as well. And I think partly that taught me the value of collaboration. But also when I was coming home, I'd often fly back through Milan or, Frankfurt or something like that. And there was always just the kind of, for me, the emotional sense of when I touched down there, coming from somewhere further afield, felt like I was back on home turf. I was a citizen, But I think for me, that wouldn't have been enough for me to devote my career to this. But I think I wasn't involved in the Remain campaign. I kind of watched it happen in 2015 and 2016. Although as a campaigner, watched it very much kind of, through, through fingers up to my eyes, because I was thinking this is not going well. I mean, both campaigns were awful, but the Remain campaign was obviously particularly bad because we lost a fight we really should have won, for many, many reasons, which we don't need to go into now. But I got into this at the beginning of 2018, really because it was a million years ago now, but the debate then was quite stalled. It was Theresa May's, Brexit means Brexit phase. It was before people's votes had started, the fight for a second referendum, and the debate was stalled in the Labour Party as well, between the Corbynites, who were essentially, pro-Brexit, and to be anti-Brexit meant you had to situate yourself with, the moderates like Chuck Romano and so on. So I started a campaign within the Labour Party to argue for a soft deal or for a second referendum and try to take it out of that factional fight. And so I did a lot of work with Labour MPs, many of whom are now in the shadow cabinet, perhaps soon to be cabinet ministers and prime minister if Labour wins the election. So that was my win. But more realistically, beyond that, the thing that motivated me to do that, but also the thing that's motivated me to stay involved, is its link to our departure from the EU, is linked to UK economy. But beyond that, it's linked to social justice. Because one thing that is pretty much never discussed is the fact that, yes, it's made the country poorer as a whole, but it's made the already poorer parts of the UK and already poorer households of the UK much poorer than they were before. So, for example, it hasn't had that much impact on the London economy, but it's had a big impact on the economy in the northwest or parts of Wales or Cornwall or Scotland or South Yorkshire, where I'm from and where I live. Of course, all of this is not talked about by politicians, it's not talked about by the media, but it's a real thing affecting real people's lives. People have, particularly in small and medium enterprises, which is obviously hard to measure, much harder to measure than big employers. There's been a lot of people that have, lost their jobs or had to change job or had wage reductions, not entirely linked to this. Of course, you can't, in a way, it's hard to disassociate from other government decisions, I would say poor decisions made about the economy over the last 14 years, but nonetheless, this is a significant factor. So what drove me into this was social justice and a desire to contribute to that. But of course, I have to say, 6 years ago, I did not think that I would be still working in this area now. So, and in some ways, I'm a bit of a last man standing working on it, but it's important. And I think, as we move to what is a probable change of government, it probably becomes only more important because should we get a Labour win, Labour's been very clear that its priority is economic growth. And obviously, the UK-EU relationship is one part of that. Not that I or we as an organisation argue for rejoin, partly because that's not politically possible, also because even if it were, it would take eons. In what we're looking at really is the kind of short to medium term, the next 5 years, what can be done that's going to improve outcomes for not just for business and industry, but also for the NHS, also for police and crime collaboration, also for Northern Ireland, also for collaboration, particularly on energy and climate change, which is obviously of systemic importance to us, but also to Europe as well. So that's perfect. That's my backstory.
Yeah, amazing. And that's a perfect segue. I'd love you to just sum up where exactly are we post-Brexit, in the post-Brexit context now? Obviously, people followed it very closely as we left, but it gets harder and harder to keep track of where we are in the different sectors and what the key topics are or areas are where things are stuck or where things are developing. Love your quick take on that.
Well, essentially, I mean, not much has happened since we left. So we left, you'll remember, and your listeners no doubt will remember, the talk of leaving with a no-deal Brexit in the event we got one, at the 11th hour. And the main two Brexit agreements, really. The main one, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is essentially a free trade agreement between the UK and the EU. And then secondarily, what was called the Northern Ireland Protocol, now essentially renamed the Windsor Framework, that governs trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because, of course, Northern Ireland, because of where it's situated, has stayed in the European Union single market for goods, though not for services. So therefore, there's a border down the Irish Sea, a trade border down the Irish Sea. So since then, of course, you may remember again at the time, Boris Johnson, David Frost and others talking up the chances of the UK's great future if we diverge from EU standards, as in change our standards, regulations on business or products or the way we trade with other nations or anything like that. Essentially, what's happened, though, is that the government has recognised the reality that there is no economic benefit in doing that. So there was planned to be this big bonfire of EU laws and regulations, which could have caused chaos, because what they were initially talking about would have affected things like seatbelt regulations or airline regulations. I mean, at one point the planes might have just had to stop flying, which would have been ludicrous, and many other things would have stopped. That didn't happen. I mean, the government we've had, they eventually backed off and have really not chosen to deregulate or deviate from EU standards much at all, partly because there's been no point, there would have been no benefit, also because they had significant representation from business and industry saying, look, this is just going to make our life more complicated. It will in the end harm the economy, it will harm our ability to employ people, harm our ability to trade, harm our ability to contribute to our communities and society. So effectively, the government listened to that and then backed off. So, of course, divergence, as in change of rules between the UK and the EU, has happened anyway, partly because our government has passed laws since then, which has had an impact, but also because the EU is not static. It has been developing its own legislation, either by passing new laws or standards or regulations, or through ECJ, European Court of Justice, case law, which has had a consequent impact on laws that we're, ostensibly signed up to. So all of this has been happening. Nobody's really been tracking that in detail because we haven't really had a significant presence as a government or as a country in Brussels to understand what they've been doing. And of course, they have not been, to a degree, they monitor UK legislation because what they don't want is us undercutting their markets or their businesses. That's something they were concerned about, but are now fairly relaxed about because we just haven't done it. So that's where we are now. Of course, given a likely change of government, we'll shift from a government that didn't want to talk about Brexit, didn't want to admit that it has any negative impacts, to a government that will admit those things and will want to begin to put things back together between the UK and the EU. It's not divorced from the politics. There's still rightly in Labour a caution about reopening the divide between Leave voters and Remain voters, which was so toxic for our country for so long. So it needs to live within that reality, and hence the Labour Party has ruled out rejoining single market customs union or going back to freedom of movement. But the other reality is from the EU side. The EU, they're not waiting with bated breath for a UK government to decide that they want to rejoin the EU by any stretch of the imagination. They are enlarging to a host of other European nations that have not been part of the EU before, including Ukraine. They're all on a timescale. Of course, there's the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. That's taking up a lot of political time and energy. In the recent European elections, the far right did quite well. There's a lot of concern about that at member state level and at EU level as well. There's obviously the climate crisis, the energy transition. They have other things to do other than worry about the UK. And from their perspective, people over there say to me regularly, were a conversation to be open from the UK about rejoining or joining a single market or customs union? The answer for now will be no. We've got a free trade agreement. It's very recently concluded. We're not interested in anything else with you right now. You had your chance and you took it. You got the result that you got, But even in more piecemeal change and side agreements to the main trade and cooperation agreement, which is much more likely, I think that will be possible. But it will entail, a significant diplomatic effort from the UK, even under a new government. They're not sitting around waiting for us to turn back up. And indeed, any changes that are made to the agreements and to the arrangements between the two countries need to be evidence to them to benefit the EU as much as they're a benefit to the UK. Again, they're not sitting around waiting to improve our economy or our balance of trade or anything like that. So it's we're living in a new world, and I'm not sure that we as a country have woken up to the fact that we're living in a new world. We chose to be a third country, and essentially what the EU has done is say, well, yes, you are a third country, and we're going to treat you in that manner.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what Aline and I were referencing as well in the earlier part of this podcast, that really if you go to European policy discussions on many different areas, you won't hear the UK mentioned, of course. It's kind of obvious, but it's the same in Paris, in Brussels. There might be an area that you think the UK is actually quite crucial on in the world, and yet London and the UK may not get a mention. And you're absolutely right that we don't necessarily realise that sometimes in the way we talk about it. As you think about a new government coming in, what are your recommendations then for what a government needs to be looking at? And particularly the very top things that it should be focusing on to bring change about?
Well, I think the foundation for all of this is that trust is still very low. It was damaged so much during the referendum time, but then subsequently, partly under Theresa May, but much more so under Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, and was only partially rebuilt under Rishi Sunak. I think the Winter Framework did help, as in the finalised agreement between the UK and the EU over Northern Ireland. But beyond that, I think, well, what I hear from Europeans is that their view of Sunak's government is very mixed, and in some ways view it as a government group of people that would claim to do something or commit to do something and then not really follow through. So there's still a significant lack of trust. So trust is the first thing, and it needs to be rebuilt. That, of course, takes time, as we all know, because we just know that's how human beings work. We also know that means relationship. So the first thing that an incoming Labour government, should that be the result, as seems likely, needs to do is get itself in the room as much as possible. That will mean increasing the UK government's representation in Brussels and just having coffees with people and being present, finding ways that we can help. I think first and foremost, that means concluding a security and defence agreement, which both sides are definitely interested in. I think they would have been anyway, but obviously the war between Russia and Ukraine has greatly heightened the need for that. And indeed, the EU were interested in that during the first round of negotiations, or the round of negotiations we had, and Boris Johnson, said, no, I'm not interested in that in the slightest, don't want to go anywhere near it. A Labour government will be interested in that, very definitely. My understanding is that the EU will want that to be very focused on traditional security and defence, if you see what I mean, where some Labour figures have been talking about widening that to include energy, or climate-related issues or cybersecurity, and that may be a result. But I think the EU starting point would be we just want to focus on security and defence, and not. They're very much against verging into areas which will be covered by the main agreement, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. That may change, but this is my understanding at the minute. Beyond that, the UK will need to also use the Trade and Cooperation Agreement to its own advantage, because it was established in it's very comprehensive, and it is part of what it established is lots of committees and discussion forums, most of which haven't been actioned, or if they have been actioned, have only been actioned partially. So if Labour puts time and effort into getting those things up and running and creating discussion forums between itself and the EU on a whole range of issues, covering everything that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement covers, really, that will create opportunities to have discussions and to essentially turn up and be a willing and able and keen and trustworthy participant. All of this is going to help further down the line. But I think security and defence is definitely the way to start, as well as fulfilling our commitments under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And there are other areas, most of which are very technical, where we are not fulfilling our commitments under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement or under the Winter Framework, which are a constant frustration to the EU, and they would like us to fulfill them. So one of the things, again, that people at the EU end have said to me is you need to fulfill these things. Some of them may have some perhaps quite minimal negative impact on our trade. It may be even raising further trade barriers that we haven't done yet because we haven't completed our side of the deal. But if we want to rebuild trust, we're going to have to do what we committed to do, or rather what the previous government committed to do. But of course the EU just look at the UK government as the UK government.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting that, we're talking, of course, as always, we're talking big foreign affairs, geopolitical issues, international relations, and yet the translation of that, the very basic part of it, is people being in rooms together, and there being relationships, and there being conversations, and there being decision-making tables where someone is sitting at it who is trusted and is able to then explain a certain perspective or a certain position in a way the other side understands. And it's really interesting that you're highlighting that. And it was the big critique, wasn't it, at the beginning? But I think it's a really useful reminder that that's where the heavy lifting now stands. So just to finish, we fast forward 3 years. If that work had been put in on those relationships, but also some of the other being useful and also getting win-win situations in the defence side and in the trade side, as is already agreed. What would your dream be? What would it look like? Where would we get to?
Well, I think what we will have a security defence agreement. That will mean that David Lammy perhaps John Healey, so Shadow Foreign Secretary currently and Shadow Defence Secretary, soon to be, I would imagine, actual Foreign Secretary, Defence Secretary, if they're sitting around the table when security and defence discussions are happening in the EU, I would imagine that will be that will enable them to engender relationships, to engender trust, and to rebuild the reputation, and to evidence trustworthiness from the UK to the EU. That's going to have a significant impact. I would imagine that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves will be spending time in European capitals and in Brussels when they can, although obviously their focus is going to be on the UK, getting the economy going, bringing inflation down, keeping inflation down, generating jobs, creating growth, etc. So beyond that, I think it's difficult to say because Labour hasn't set out, I don't think, the totality, and I understand why, maybe I'm wrong, of its plans. But what it has talked about is an SPS agreement, which means an agreement on agricultural products so that they don't face checks when they go through the port, which will bring down prices and ease things for traders and agricultural producers. Recognition of professional qualifications and easier movement for creatives. But even talking about those things, an SPS agreement would take at least 2 years to negotiate and another year to implement. If Labour wants that, it's going to need to open that conversation this autumn if it wants it done before the next election. On the others, I know that the EU is sceptical because it views the professional qualifications as just giving away economic activity to the UK. Why would it do that? And on the movement side, it's no great advantage to them to give movement to creators because we get 27 countries to go to, they get one. So all of this needs to be seen in a wider conversation. So I think Labour needs to be very clear what it wants to achieve, and it needs to set out why it's going to be in the interest of the EU as well as the UK, and then seek to negotiate it. But it will take time. So I think my dream in 3 years is certainly that we've got a very clear view of what we want to achieve. Secondly, that trust has been significantly rebuilt, and I genuinely believe that it will be, and that serious negotiations and discussions are happening on things that will improve collaboration, not just in trade, but also in energy and climate, health and social care, police and crime collaboration, because these are all things that would improve outcomes for the people who live and work in the UK. But the final thing I'll say is that if Labour goes down this road, and I believe that it will, I think it's important that some things are concluded by the next election, because assuming the Conservative Party stays where it is, they will be saying, look, Labour's in the middle of trying to undo Brexit. Labour needs to be able to say, this is resulting in benefits for the UK. It's easier for you to travel, for example, or you're safer because of the security and defence agreement, or your fruit and veg is cheaper because we've got an SPS agreement, or young people can travel to live and work because we've done a youth mobility deal. Those are all examples. I'm not suggesting that all those things are Labour Party policy for a minute. That's where we need to get to, I think. So that's my hope in 3 or 4 years. I also hope that actually the tension over this is really past tense. And if the Conservatives are still talking about it from a Brexit standpoint, people just see it as rather archaic and arcane because everybody's just moved on. That's my hope, because this shouldn't be, a totemic, emotional, political issue. It should just be pragmatic politics. And we've moved a long way towards that. And my hope and my belief, actually, is that we'll continue down that trajectory.
I love it. What an amazing Woodstock tour. So thank you, Mike. We really appreciate you being here, and one to watch for the next few years as we track what's happening with the EU Parliament and then the UK election and the relationship between us. Thank you, Mike.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Great British Foreign Affairs podcast, where Britain meets the world. Subscribe today, share it with a friend or colleague, and be part of shaping Britain's role on the global stage.